In August of the year 1881, in the high Swiss valley of the Engadine, a solitary man of 36 was walking beside a lake. He was not an imposing figure. He was slight, unwell, dressed in the careful, shabby manner of a man who had once been a professor and was now nothing in particular, and his eyes, behind their thick lenses, were so damaged that on his worst days he could not read for more than 20 minutes at a stretch, and sometimes could not bear light at all. He had come to this valley, as he came every summer, because the thin, cold air and the silence gave him a few weeks of relief from the headaches that otherwise took him for days at a time, that left him vomiting into a basin in a darkened room, unable to work, unable to think, waiting for the pain to pass so he could begin again. He had resigned his university chair 2 years earlier because his body would not let him keep it. He had no wife, no household, no position, almost no readers. He was walking, as he did for hours every day, because walking was the only condition in which his thinking seemed to work. He stopped at a great pyramidal block of stone that rose beside the path near the village of Surlege, on the shore of Lake Silvaplana, and there, standing in the mountain light, a thought came to him that he said afterward had arrived like a lightning strike, and that he would spend the rest of his working life trying to make bearable. He wrote later that the thought came to him 6,000 feet beyond man and time, and he noted the date and the place with the precision of a man recording a conversion. The thought was this: what if everything that has ever happened, and everything you have ever done and suffered, were to repeat itself, exactly as it was, in every smallest detail, endlessly, forever? Not a better version, not a corrected draft. This life, precisely as you have lived it, with every humiliation and every wasted afternoon and every grief in exactly the place it fell, returning again and again without limit. What if a demon were to creep up to you in your loneliest loneliness and tell you that this is your future? Would you throw yourself down and curse him? Or is there any moment in your life so tremendous that you would answer him differently, that you would call him a god and say that you had never heard anything more divine? The irony was almost too perfect. Of all the people in Europe on whom such a thought might have descended, it descended on very nearly the one with the least reason to welcome it. Here was a man whose life, judged by any ordinary standard, had been a sequence of losses. He had lost his father at 4. He had lost his health in his 20s and never recovered it. He had lost his great friendship with the most famous artist in Germany. He had lost his professorship, his country, his religion, and the ordinary comforts of a settled life, and he was about to lose the one love he ever seriously pursued. His books were selling in the dozens. He spent his winters in cheap rooms in foreign cities, eating badly, writing letters to friends who wrote back less and less. And this was the man who received the thought that says, "Would you take all of it again? Exactly, forever?" And what makes Friedrich Nietzsche one of the strangest and most bracing figures in the history of philosophy is his answer. He did not say no. He did not conclude, as almost anyone would, that a life like his was an argument against the whole enterprise of living. He turned instead and made of that question the central discipline of his existence, and gave the discipline a name he took from the Latin, 2 words that would become the compressed statement of everything he had to teach: Amor Fati, love of fate. Not resignation to fate, not the grim endurance of the Stoic, not the patient acceptance of the believer who trusts a plan. Love, the active, willed, difficult affirmation of one's life, exactly as it is, including the parts that hurt, including the parts that cannot be justified, on the grounds that they are the parts that made you, and that a person who could subtract them would be subtracting themselves. His formulation reads, across the century and a half since, less like a doctrine of a distant German professor than like something said quietly to anyone lying awake and totting up the things they wish had gone otherwise. He was not interested in consoling anyone, and he would have despised the idea that he was offering comfort. He was interested in something harder, and in the end, more useful than comfort. The journey that follows moves through the whole of that life, slowly, in its own time. It begins in a country parsonage in Prussia, in the childhood of a boy who lost his father before he was 5 and was raised in a house full of grieving women, and who was so solemn and so devout that the other children called him the little pastor. It moves through his astonishing early rise. The classical prodigy made a full professor at 24, before he had even finished his doctorate, And through the two great enthusiasms of his youth, the philosophy of Schopenhauer and the friendship of Wagner, both of which he had to break with in order to become himself. It follows the collapse of his health and the strange liberation that followed it, the resignation, the wandering years in cheap rooms across Italy and the Alps, the books written in fragments between attacks of pain, the discovery that walking and altitude and solitude were the conditions of his thought. And from there it moves into the ideas themselves, in the order he came to them, the death of God and the vertigo it opened, the rock at Silvaplana and the thought of eternal return, the resolution he made one New Year's Day to become, from that point on, a person who says yes, the strange prophetic book that came to him in bursts of 10 days at a time, the failed love and the deepest winter of his loneliness, and the final, extraordinary year of work before the silence, when a man whom almost nobody was reading wrote, in a matter of months, several of the books that would eventually turn the century upside down. Each phase grew out of the one before it, and each was, in his own account, a further stage in a single project, which was learning to say yes. It is a long road, and there is no hurry on it. Let it unfold at the pace of breathing. Long before the rock, before the mountains, before any of the yes-saying, there was a small boy in a parsonage who was learning, very early, about loss. Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche was born on the 15th of October, in the year 1844, in the village of Rücken, in Prussian Saxony, the son of a Lutheran pastor. He was born, as it happened, on the birthday of the reigning king of Prussia, after whom he was named, a coincidence the family took some pride in. His father, Karl Ludwig Nietzsche, was a gentle and musical man, himself the son of a pastor, as was his wife's father. The boy was born into a family in which the ministry was simply what the men of the house did, generation after generation, and in which the language of God and duty and the soul was the ordinary air of the household. When Friedrich was 4 years old, his father began to suffer from a brain ailment that no one could treat. He declined over many months, losing his sight, his faculties, and finally his life, and he died in the summer of 1849, at the age of 35. The boy was not yet 5. A few months later, his younger brother Joseph died as well, in infancy, and Nietzsche recorded a dream from that period, one that stayed with him for the rest of his life, in which he heard the church organ playing and saw his father's grave open, and his father rise in his shroud, go into the church, and return carrying a small child in his arms, and the grave closed over them both. The next day, the child fell ill and died. What followed was a childhood of a particular and formative kind. The family, having lost the pastorate along with the pastor, moved to the town of Naumburg, and the boy grew up in a household consisting entirely of women, his mother, his sister Elizabeth, his grandmother, and 2 maiden aunts, all of them devout, all of them grieving, all of them devoted to the delicate and serious little boy, who was now the man of the family. He was extraordinarily well behaved. He was so scrupulous about propriety that classmates mocked him, and there is a story, probably polished by later telling but characteristic in any case, that when the other boys ran home through a downpour, young Nietzsche walked at a measured pace with his cap neatly on his head, because the school rules stated that pupils should walk home in an orderly fashion and made no exception for rain. He was also, from very early, gifted to an unusual degree. He wrote poetry and composed music, he read voraciously, and he was possessed of the kind of concentrated seriousness that adults find either impressive or unnerving. And he was devout, genuinely so, the little pastor of the schoolyard nickname, a boy who could move his classmates by reciting scripture, and who fully expected, for much of his boyhood, to enter the ministry as his father and both grandfathers had done. It is worth holding this image alongside the later one, the man who would announce the death of God. He did not arrive at that announcement as an outsider taking a cheap shot at something he had never taken seriously. He arrived at it from the inside, as a son of the parsonage who had loved the faith and had lost it slowly and at real cost, and who understood better than his contemporaries what its loss was going to mean. There is a small detail from those Naumburg years that says a great deal about the household and about what the boy absorbed from it. The women who raised him were not merely pious in a formal way, they were devout in the particular manner of a family that had been left with nothing else. for whom the faith was both consolation and identity, and who had every reason to hold to it after what had been taken from them. Nietzsche loved these women and remained, all his life, entangled with them in ways that cost him dearly, especially with his sister, and he grew up watching, at close quarters, what religion actually does for people in extremity, which is not nothing. He never made the mistake of the confident village atheist who imagines that faith is simply an error to be corrected, and that its removal costs nothing. He knew exactly what it had been holding up in that house, and it is precisely because he knew that his later announcement carries the note of alarm rather than of triumph. The madman with the lantern is not celebrating. He is asking who gave us the sponge to wipe away the horizon. At 14, he won a place at Schulpforta, the most rigorous boarding school in Germany, an old Cistercian monastery converted into an academy that produced classical scholars the way a foundry produces iron. The regime was severe, the days beginning before dawn and organized around Greek and Latin with a thoroughness that has few modern equivalents, and Nietzsche flourished in it and was damaged by it in roughly equal measure. He acquired there the extraordinary command of the ancient languages and the ancient world that would make his professional reputation, and he acquired also, in those years of overwork in bad light, the first of the headaches that would eventually take his working life from him. It was at Schulpforta, too, that the faith began quietly to come apart. Nothing dramatic happened. There was no crisis, no rebellion. He simply began to apply to the scriptures the same philological methods he was being taught to apply to Homer and Sophocles, reading them as texts with histories, written by particular people in particular circumstances for particular purposes, and the reading did what such reading tends to do. By the time he arrived at university, the boy who had expected to become a pastor had become a young man who could not honestly do so. He enrolled at Bonn to study theology and classical philology as his mother wished, and after 2 semesters he dropped the theology, which caused a painful scene at home, and followed his teacher Friedrich Nietzsche to Leipzig to devote himself entirely to the ancient world. What happened next was almost unheard of. Nietzsche's work as a student was so exceptional that when the University of Basel found itself needing a professor of classical philology, Ritschl recommended his young pupil in terms so extravagant that they still read as slightly implausible, saying that in nearly 40 years of teaching, he had never known a young man ripen so early. Basel offered the position. Nietzsche was 24 years old and had not yet completed his doctorate. Leipzig simply conferred it on him without examination, on the strength of his published articles, so that he could take up the chair. He became one of the youngest professors of classical philology in European history, and he moved to Switzerland in the spring of 1869, renouncing his Prussian citizenship in the process, and remaining, for the rest of his life, officially stateless. He should have been, by every external measure, an enormous success, and for a few years he looked like one. But 2 encounters from those early years were already at work in him, and both would have to be broken before he could become the philosopher he was going to be. The first he had made as a student, quite by accident, in a second-hand bookshop in Leipzig. He had picked up a volume he did not know, by an author he had barely heard of, and taken it home, and been unable to put it down. The book was The World as Will and Representation, and its author, Arthur Schopenhauer, had died a few years earlier, in obscurity, after a lifetime of being ignored. Nietzsche read it, he said, as though the author were speaking directly to him, and for a period of years he considered himself entirely a disciple. What captivated him was partly the philosophy and partly the man. Here was a thinker who wrote magnificent German prose rather than academic fog, who had cared nothing for professional advancement, who had told the truth as he saw it into an empty room for 40 years. Schopenhauer taught that beneath the orderly world of appearances there churns a blind, restless, purposeless force he called the will, that this will drives all living things into ceaseless striving, that the striving can never be satisfied because satisfaction only produces new striving, and that existence is therefore fundamentally a matter of suffering. The only wisdom available, on this account, is to see through the illusion, to turn away, to quiet the will through art and compassion, and finally, through a kind of renunciation of life itself. Nietzsche absorbed the diagnosis completely and would never entirely abandon it. He agreed, all his life, that existence involves suffering that cannot be argued away. that there is no cosmic justice underwriting our experience, that the world is not arranged for our benefit. What he would eventually reject, with all the force he had, was the conclusion. Schopenhauer had looked at the suffering and concluded that life should be denied. Everything Nietzsche would later write is an attempt to look at exactly the same suffering and arrive at the opposite conclusion, to find a way of saying yes that is not naive, that has fully absorbed the worst that can be said about existence, and affirms it anyway. Amor Fati is, in a sense, his lifelong reply to the book he found in the second-hand shop. He never stopped admiring Schopenhauer as a man. He simply came to believe that his teacher had lost his nerve. The second encounter was with a living man, and it went much deeper and hurt much more. In November of 1868, still a student, Nietzsche was introduced to Richard Wagner, then in his mid-50s, the most famous and most controversial artist in Europe. The two men discovered an immediate affinity, not least because Wagner was himself a passionate admirer of Schopenhauer, and the young philologist was taken up into the composer's circle. When Nietzsche moved to Basel the following year, he found that Wagner was living at Tribschen on Lake Lucerne, within easy traveling distance, and for the next several years he went there constantly, sometimes for weeks at a time. He was given his own room in the house. He ran errands for the family, played the piano with Wagner's wife Cosima, and was treated as something between a brilliant protégé and an adopted son. It is not difficult to see what he had found. Nietzsche had lost his father at 4 and had grown up in a house of women, and here was a man of overwhelming vitality and genius, 31 years his senior, exactly his dead father's generation, who took him seriously and drew him into the most exciting artistic project in Europe. Wagner was building an entire aesthetic and cultural movement, a plan to regenerate German culture through a new kind of total artwork, and Nietzsche threw himself into it with everything he had. His first book, The Birth of Tragedy, published in 1872, was in large part a philosophical justification of the Wagnerian project, arguing that Greek tragedy had been born from the tension between the Apollonian impulse toward form and order and the Dionysian impulse toward ecstasy and dissolution, and that Wagner's music drama was the rebirth of that lost union. The book was a catastrophe for his academic career. It was not conventional philology at all. It made almost no use of the scholarly apparatus. It argued by intuition and rhetoric, and it culminated in what looked to his colleagues like propaganda for a contemporary composer. A leading young scholar published a pamphlet demolishing it, and the philological establishment largely turned its back. Students stopped enrolling in Nietzsche's courses. He had, in his first book, thrown away the profession he had entered so spectacularly, and though he did not fully realize it yet, he had also begun the process of becoming something other than a professor. The break with Wagner, when it came, was slow and then total, and Nietzsche described it ever afterward as one of the great wounds of his life. Several things converged. There was the matter of Bayreuth itself. When the festival theatre Wagner had dreamed of finally opened in 1876, Nietzsche attended and was appalled, not by the music, but by the spectacle around it, the aristocrats and the sponsors, and the atmosphere of a fashionable cultural event, which seemed to him the precise opposite of the austere Greek renewal he had imagined he was serving. He left partway through, unable to bear it. There was the growing nationalism and anti-Semitism of Wagner's circle, which Nietzsche found repellent and which he would attack with increasing ferocity for the rest of his working life. And there was, finally, Parsifal, Wagner's last work, saturated in Christian symbolism, which struck Nietzsche as a betrayal of everything the older man had claimed to stand for, the free spirit sinking to his knees before the cross. He never saw Wagner again after 1876. The composer died in 1883, and Nietzsche, who by then had been attacking him in print for years, wept when he heard the news, and wrote that it was hard to have been for 6 years the closest friend of a man one has had to break with. The relationship kept working in him to the very end. Among the last things he wrote were 2 short books about Wagner, still arguing, still settling accounts with a man 5 years dead. Having lost a father in childhood, he had found and lost another in adulthood, and both losses became, in his philosophy, occasions for the same lesson, that one must eventually stand alone, that the disciple who does not surpass the master has failed him, and that gratitude and independence are not opposites. While all of this was happening, His body was going to pieces. The symptoms had begun in his student years and worsened steadily through the Basel decade. Violent headaches lasting days, severe eye pain, and deteriorating vision, nausea and vomiting, so persistent that he sometimes could not keep food down for a week. The origin has never been settled, and the theories are many, ranging from an inherited neurological condition of the sort that killed his father, to migraine of extraordinary severity, to the effects of an infection contracted in his 20s. What is not in doubt is the extent of the disruption. He recorded, in 1 year, well over 100 days lost entirely to attacks. He was repeatedly granted sick leave. He worked in pencil in half darkness, dictated when he could not write, and composed a great deal of his philosophy in his head while walking, because walking was the one activity his body permitted, and often the only time his mind was clear. In the spring of 1879, at the age of 34, he resigned his professorship. The university granted him a modest pension, and with it, he became what he would remain for the next 10 years, a stateless invalid of no fixed address, moving with the seasons in search of weather his body could tolerate. Winters in Genoa, in Nice, in Rapallo, in Turin. Summers in the Engadine, at Sils Maria, where the altitude gave him relief. He lived in rented rooms, ate simply, kept to rigid routines, walked for hours every day, and wrote, in the intervals between attacks, the books that nobody was buying. And here is one of the strangest and most important turns in his whole story. He came to regard this catastrophe as the best thing that ever happened to him. Not in the sense of pretending it was pleasant, and not in the sense of claiming that it had been sent to teach him something. He had no belief in any agency that might send such things. He meant something more difficult and more precise, that the illness had performed a function in his life which nothing else could have performed, and that the person he became was inseparable from it. It took his profession away, and the profession had been slowly strangling his thought. It took away his capacity for continuous scholarly labor, and so forced him into the aphorism, the short, concentrated burst, which turned out to be his true form. It made ordinary social and academic life impossible, and thereby gave him solitude, which was the condition of everything he wrote. It made him intimately acquainted with pain and with the psychology of the sufferer, which gave him his uncanny eye for the ways human beings dress up weakness as virtue. He wrote later that a long illness of this kind teaches one to see differently, that it functions as a great detachment, forcing the sufferer to look at their own former convictions from the outside and to ask what such convictions are for. Sickness, he said, had been the real teacher, and he described himself in one of his most striking phrases as having become, through it, a person who could look out from the perspective of the sick toward healthier concepts, and from the fullness of life look down into the secret work of decline. He had been given a double vision, and he thought it was the source of his gift. This is also where his idea of what he called the great health belongs, and it is one of the more surprising things in a philosophy so associated with strength. Health, for Nietzsche, was never simply the absence of illness, and he had contempt for the bland, unbroken well-being that he associated with the comfortable and the incurious. The great health, in his sense, is something achieved rather than possessed, a condition of a person who has been through sickness, doubt, and collapse, has lost their certainties, and has come out on the other side, with a constitution capable of digesting the experience, rather than being poisoned by it. It is not the health of someone who has never been wounded, but of someone who has been wounded and has metabolized it, and it is available only on the far side of the wound. He believed his own long illness had given him precisely this, and that it accounted for the strange cheerfulness that runs through even his darkest books, a cheerfulness which readers who expect grim German profundity often find disconcerting. He titled one of his books The Gay Science, and he meant the lightness in the title seriously. The person who has genuinely faced the worst has, he thought, earned a certain buoyancy that the untested cannot counterfeit. That is also why he insisted, again and again, that his philosophy was not for everyone and was not intended to be. He was not a public moralist offering rules for the general improvement of conduct. He wrote for what he called free spirits, by which he meant people willing to give up the comfort of inherited certainties without immediately reaching for a replacement, and he expected such people to be rare. The subtitle he gave to Zarathustra was a book for everyone and no one, and the joke in it is entirely serious. The teaching is addressed to all and receivable by almost none, not because it is difficult to understand, but because very few people are willing to be alone with what it costs. This is the first full appearance of what would become Amor Fati, and it is worth being careful about what he is and is not saying. He is not saying the illness was good. He is not saying it was worth it in some cosmic ledger. He is certainly not saying that suffering is ennobling in general, a proposition he mocked wherever he met it. He is saying that this particular calamity became inseparable from this particular life and this particular work, that it could not be subtracted without subtracting everything that came out of it, and that therefore a person who genuinely affirms the work must also affirm the calamity that produced it. The affirmation is not of suffering as such. It is of the whole, indivisible, actual life which happens to contain it. The wandering years that followed were the most productive of his life. Freed from lecturing, he wrote in a rush of books that came faster as his readership shrank. Human, all too human, Daybreak, The Gay Science, and then, in a burst of extraordinary intensity, the work he considered his masterpiece. He worked in the mornings, walked enormous distances in the afternoons, ate alone, went to bed early, and saw almost no one for months at a time. His letters from this period are full of the loneliness, sometimes stoically, sometimes not. He described himself once as a man who had lost all human company and who spoke to himself with an audacity born of that silence. He was, by any conventional measure, failing. His books sold in tiny numbers. One of them found perhaps a few dozen buyers. He paid for some of them out of his own pension. He was reviewed rarely and understood almost not at all. The walking deserves its own attention, because it was not incidental to the philosophy, but very nearly its method. Nietzsche walked 6, 8, sometimes 10 hours a day, along the lake paths of the Engadine in summer, and the coastal roads above Genoa and Nice in winter, carrying a notebook, stopping to scribble, moving on. He came to believe that thought, which had not been arrived at in motion, was not to be trusted, and he said so repeatedly, and with some contempt for the alternative. Only thoughts reached by walking have value, he wrote. He distrusted the sedentary intellect on principle, suspecting that a philosophy composed by a man sitting still in a heated room would end up recommending, in one disguise or another, sitting still in a heated room. And there is something in the shape of his prose that bears this out. He did not write treatises with a beginning and a middle and an end, marching from premise to conclusion. He wrote in bursts, in aphorisms, in paragraphs that arrive at a summit and stop, which is the shape of thinking done in short intervals on a mountain path, by a man who cannot use his eyes for long, and must hold everything in his head until he can get it down. The solitude likewise was both an affliction and a condition of the work, and he was entirely clear-eyed about the double aspect. He complained of it bitterly in his letters, to Overbeck, to his old friend Peter Gast, to his mother, describing months in which he spoke to no one but landladies and waiters, and the toll it took is plain enough. And yet he also cultivated it, chose it, defended it, and drew from it the vantage point that gives his writing its peculiar force. A man who has removed himself entirely from the society whose values he is examining can see those values with a clarity unavailable to anyone still comfortably inside them, in the way that a person who has stopped drinking sees a party differently at midnight. He described himself once as a man who had gone away and stayed away long enough that the whole thing could be looked at from outside, and this position, purchased at a price he never pretended was small, is what made him the most penetrating diagnostician of his century. And it was in the middle of these years, in the summer of 1881, at the great rock beside the lake, that the thought arrived that would organize everything else. To understand why that thought struck him with such force, we have to understand the situation he believed his civilization was in, and this brings us to the phrase that has followed his name ever since, usually torn from its context, and almost always misunderstood. God is dead. He first stated it in The Gay Science, the book he was writing in those very years, and he stated it not in triumph but in something much closer to alarm. The passage in which it appears is a small piece of theatre. A madman runs into the marketplace in the bright morning carrying a lantern, and cries out that he is looking for God. The people standing about, most of whom no longer believe, find this very funny and mock him. Has God got lost, they ask. Is he hiding? Has he emigrated? And the madman turns on them and delivers the announcement that has echoed for a century and a half. God is dead, he tells them, and we have killed him, all of us, and we are his murderers. And then, crucially, he asks a series of questions that are not triumphant at all, but vertiginous. How were we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Are we not plunging continually, backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there any up or down left? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? And then the madman falls silent, looks at his listeners, and says that he has come too early, that this tremendous event is still on its way, that the light of the dead stars still reaches us, though the stars themselves are extinguished. The deed has been done, but the news of it has not yet arrived. That is the announcement, and it is worth being precise about what it means, because it is not an argument for atheism. Nietzsche is not trying to persuade anyone that God does not exist. He takes it for granted that his contemporaries have already, in practice, stopped believing. The claim is historical and cultural rather than theological. He is saying that the Christian God had functioned for centuries as the foundation of the entire European structure of meaning and value, the guarantee that there was a purpose to history, an order to nature, a ground for morality, a point to suffering, a difference between higher and lower. And he is saying that this foundation has now been removed, quietly, by the very culture that built on it, through science and scholarship and honesty, and that almost nobody has yet grasped what follows. The madman's questions are the point. Without that fixed sun, what is up and what is down? On what basis does anyone now say that anything matters more than anything else? He thought the answer his contemporaries had quietly adopted was the worst of the available options, which was to keep the morality and discard the foundation, to go on believing in the value of pity and equality and self-denial while abandoning the theology that had made sense of them, and to imagine that this was intellectual progress rather than a species of sleepwalking. In England especially, he thought, the moralists had performed this trick with a straight face, giving up God on Monday and continuing to preach the Christian virtues on Tuesday as though nothing had happened, as though those virtues were simply self-evident features of the universe, rather than the specific products of a particular faith. He regarded this as neither honest nor stable. When one gives up the Christian faith, he wrote, one pulls the right to Christian morality out from under one's feet. The values had a foundation, the foundation had been removed, and the values were now hanging in the air, and sooner or later, he predicted, people would notice. What he expected to follow that noticing was 2 centuries of nihilism, and it is difficult to read his forecasts of the coming century without a certain chill. He predicted wars of a kind the earth had not yet seen, fought over doctrines and ideas rather than territory. He predicted the arrival of political movements that would function as replacement religions, offering the certainty and the belonging that the churches had provided, with none of the restraints. He predicted the small, comfortable nihilism of a society that has given up asking what anything is for, and has settled instead for distraction and security. The condition he sketched in the figure of the last man, who has his little pleasure for the day and his little pleasure for the night, who blinks and who has invented happiness. And he predicted, most darkly, that his own name would be attached to some of it, that he would be misunderstood in exactly the way that would most have appalled him, which is precisely what his sister then arranged. Nietzsche's fear was not that people would become wicked without God. It was something subtler and, he thought, worse. His fear was nihilism, the condition in which the old values have lost their authority, but no new ones have taken their place, and a civilization drifts in a kind of exhausted shrug in which nothing is worth very much, and nothing is worth doing greatly. He believed that the 19th century was already sliding into this, that it was concealing the slide with substitute faiths, in progress, in the nation, in science, in various political enthusiasms, all of which were, in his diagnosis, the shadows of the dead God still cast on the wall. And he set himself the task of finding, in the ruins, some ground on which a person might affirm existence without appeal to any authority outside it. Not a new God, not a consoling story, something that could be said yes to with the eyes fully open. That is the question he was carrying when he stopped at the rock beside Lake Silvaplana in August of 1881. The thought that came to him there is usually called the eternal recurrence, and it has been argued over ever since, in part because Nietzsche presented it in two quite different ways. In his unpublished notebooks, he sometimes played with it as a cosmological hypothesis, sketching arguments from finite matter and infinite time to the conclusion that every configuration must repeat. Those arguments are not very good, and he never published them. What he did publish, and what he clearly cared about, is something else entirely: the recurrence as a test, a thought experiment aimed at the heart, designed to measure how a person actually stands toward their own existence. He puts it in the gay science, in the form of a demon. Imagine that in your loneliest loneliness, a demon crept up to you and said, "This life, as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more, and innumerable times more, and there will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy, and every thought and sigh, everything unspeakably small or great, must return to you, all in the same succession and sequence, and this same spider, and this moonlight between the trees, and this same moment, and I myself. The eternal hourglass of existence is turned over again and again, and you with it, a speck of dust." And then he asks, would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or have you once experienced a tremendous moment when you would have answered him, "You are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine"? That is the whole of it. It is not a description of the universe. It is a question put to a life, and it is a question of extraordinary force, because it removes every escape route we ordinarily use. We are permitted, in the usual way of things, to hold our lives at a slight distance, to regard the disappointing parts as provisional, to tell ourselves that the real thing has not started yet, that this is a rough draft and there will be a fair copy, that it will be redeemed later, elsewhere, by something. The demon's proposal abolishes all of that at a stroke. There is no later. There is no elsewhere. There is no draft. This, exactly this, is the whole of what there is, and the question is simply whether you can bear it, whether you can want it, whether you would take it again. Nietzsche called it the greatest weight, and he meant that phrase precisely. The thought lies upon your actions like a weight, because if this hour is to return forever, then this hour is not a small thing you can spend carelessly on the way to something better. It is a permanent feature of the universe. Every choice acquires a strange gravity, and at the same time, he thought, it is the greatest possible liberation, because a person who could genuinely say yes to that proposition would be free of the whole apparatus of regret and postponement and grievance in which most lives are spent. They would be, in his phrase, well disposed toward themselves and toward life. It is worth noticing how the thought works as a practical instrument, because Nietzsche clearly intended it to be used and not merely contemplated. Applied to a decision, it functions as a kind of clarifying pressure, not simply, do I want this, but do I want this to be a permanent feature of the universe, repeated without end? A great many of the things we do out of habit, or laziness, or the desire to avoid an awkward conversation, do not survive that question at all, and the recognition that they do not is itself informative. Applied to a completed life, or to a stretch of one, it works differently, as a diagnostic of how a person actually stands toward their own existence, beneath whatever they say about it. It is easy to claim contentment. It is much harder to claim it in the face of the demon, who is proposing not a general improvement but this, exactly this, the same spider, and the same moonlight, and the same conversation you handled badly, forever. And Nietzsche was honest enough to indicate that he himself found the thought a burden as often as a liberation, which is why in Zarathustra it is presented as something the prophet must be made ill by before he can carry it. The abysmal thought, he calls it there. He did not present affirmation as a mood that descends on a person who has understood the argument, and he never described himself as having achieved it once and for all. It is a resolution renewed, a practice returned to, something to be learned more and more, as he put it in the New Year passage, in a phrase that quietly concedes he had not learned it yet. The name he gave to that disposition, The state of the person who can meet the demon and answer him with a yes is Amor Fati. He announced it as a resolution, which is a revealing way to introduce a philosophical idea, and he did it on New Year's Day of 1882, in the opening pages of the 4th book of the Gay Science, a few months after the thought at the Rock. He wrote that he still lived, that he still thought, and that he wanted to say what he wished for himself in the coming year, and what thought should be for him from now on, the ground and the guarantee of all his sweetness. He wanted, he said, to learn more and more, to see what is necessary in things as what is beautiful in them. In this way, he would be one of those who make things beautiful. Amor Fati. Let that be his love from now on. He did not want to wage war against ugliness. He did not want to accuse. He did not even want to accuse the accusers. Looking away should be his only negation. And all in all, he concluded, he wished to be at some point nothing but a yes-sayer. Several things in that passage deserve attention, because they are what separate Amor Fati from the various things it is usually mistaken for. The first is that it is a resolution rather than a discovery. He is not reporting that he has found the world to be lovable. He is committing himself to a practice, to a way of looking, which he expects to have to learn more and more over time. It is closer to a discipline than to a belief. The second is the phrase about seeing what is necessary in things as what is beautiful in them. This is the technical core of the idea. Fate, for Nietzsche, is not a plan. There is no author arranging events. Fate is simply necessity. The fact that everything that has happened and could not now be otherwise, and that the whole web of it hangs together so tightly that no single thread can be pulled out without unraveling the rest. Your life is not a series of separable episodes, some of which you would keep and some of which you would return to the shop. It is one thing. The person you are was made by every part of it, including the parts you would never have chosen, and a person who wishes those parts away is wishing themselves away. Amor Fati is the recognition of that indivisibility, followed by the decision to love the whole rather than to spend a life in litigation against the parts. The third is what he says about negation. Looking away shall be my only negation. This is a striking piece of psychological advice from a man usually remembered for his ferocity. He is saying that the energy spent in accusation, in resentment, in the endless internal case against what has happened and who is to blame for it, is energy taken directly out of a life. He had thought harder than almost anyone about resentment. It was the subject of his later work on the origins of morality, where he traced whole moral systems back to the resentment of those who could not act, and who therefore made a virtue of not acting. He regarded resentment as the great poison, the thing that turns a person's strength against their own existence. Amor Fati is, among other things, the antidote he prescribed for it, and he prescribed it first to himself, because he was a man with an unusually well-stocked cabinet of grievances and knew perfectly well what it cost him to keep opening it. And the fourth thing is the modesty of the ambition. I wish to be at some point nothing but a yes-sayer. At some point, he is not claiming to have arrived. He was writing this as a stateless invalid of 37 with almost no readers, in a rented room, between attacks of pain that regularly left him unable to work for days. The resolution is an aspiration formed in full view of everything that made it difficult, which is what gives it its authority. It is very easy to love one's fate when one's fate has been kind. The formulation is only worth anything coming from someone in a position to refuse it, and he was. There is a further subtlety here that is easily lost, and it concerns the direction in which Amor Fati points. It is a stance toward the past and the present, not a policy for the future. Nietzsche is not saying that whatever comes next should be accepted without struggle. That would contradict everything else in him, since he was the great celebrant of striving, of resistance, of the will that shapes and makes and overcomes. What is necessary, in his sense, is what has already happened, the fixed and finished portion of a life, the part that is no longer subject to negotiation. Toward that, the only available attitudes are love, endurance, or grievance, and he is arguing that the first is the only one that does not leach strength out of the person holding it. Toward the future, by contrast, everything remains open, and the person who has stopped fighting the unchangeable past has, precisely, more force available for the changeable future. The doctrine is not a counsel of passivity, but its opposite, a way of recovering the enormous quantity of energy that most people spend on relitigating what cannot be altered and putting it back into what can. He also thought, and this is characteristic of the psychologist in him, that the way a person relates to their own past is visible in almost everything else about them. The one who cannot forgive their own history tends to develop a certain relationship to other people's happiness, a certain reflex of diminishment, a habit of finding in every good thing the flaw that justifies not having to admire it. Resentment, in his account, is not simply an unpleasant emotion, but a whole orientation, a slow reversal in which the inability to act becomes recast as the virtue of not acting, and weakness dresses itself up as principle. He believed he could detect this reversal at work in entire moral systems, and much of his later writing is an attempt to trace it. And the personal remedy he proposed was not to argue oneself out of resentment, which does not work, but to take up the opposite practice, deliberately, as a discipline, to look for the necessity in what happened, to find the beauty in the necessity, and to spend one's negation on looking away rather than on accusation. It is worth pausing to distinguish this from the things it resembles, because the differences are what make it useful. It is not stoic resignation, the acceptance of what cannot be changed as the price of tranquility. Nietzsche wanted something warmer and more active than acceptance, and he found the stoic ideal of freedom from passion to be a covert form of the life denial he was trying to escape. It is not optimism, the belief that things will turn out well, or that the world is arranged for our good. He thought that was childish, and worse, dishonest. It is not the religious trust that suffering is part of a hidden plan. He had no plan on offer, and said so. And it is emphatically not passivity. Nietzsche was one of the great celebrants of striving, creation, self-overcoming. The point of loving one's fate is not to stop acting, but to act without the drag of grievance, to spend one's force on making rather than on complaining. What it is, in the end, is a way of standing toward the past. Nothing that has happened can be altered. The only question is whether we carry it as a wound we are perpetually relitigating, or as material we have taken up into what we are making. He put it in a phrase that says everything in a few words. My formula for greatness in a human being is Amor Fati, that one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity, not merely to bear what is necessary, still less to conceal it, but to love it. That last distinction is the one that matters most, and the one that is hardest to live. Not merely to bear it. Bearing is what the Stoic does, and it is admirable, and it is not what he is after. Not to conceal it, which is what the optimist does when they insist that everything happens for a reason. To love it. To arrive at a relationship with one's own life in which the difficult parts are not tolerated, but embraced as one embraces the whole of a person one loves, faults included, because the faults are not additions to the person, but part of what makes them that person, and not some smoother, blander alternative who does not exist. In the year following the thought at the Rock, two things happened to Nietzsche, one of which produced his most famous book, and the other of which nearly destroyed him, and they were tangled together. In the spring of 1882, through mutual friends in Rome, he was introduced to a young Russian woman named Lou Salome. She was 21, formidably intelligent, determined to live an intellectual life at a time when that was not readily available to women, and uninterested in marriage. Nietzsche was 37 and had spent a decade in near-total solitude. He was struck immediately, and within days of meeting her he had asked their mutual friend Paul Ray to propose marriage on his behalf, which Ray, who was himself in love with her, duly and awkwardly did. She declined. Nietzsche proposed again, in person some weeks later. She declined again. What followed was a strange summer in which the three of them attempted to live as an intellectual community, a plan they called their Trinity, studying together and traveling together, an arrangement that was scandalous by the standards of the time and unstable by any standards. There exists a photograph from that period, staged as a joke at Nietzsche's suggestion, in which Salome sits in a small cart holding a whip while the two men stand in the traces. It has been reproduced endlessly, usually with heavy irony, given the notorious line he would later write about going to women and not forgetting the whip. The trinity collapsed by the autumn amid misunderstandings, jealousy, and the active interference of Nietzsche's sister Elizabeth, who detested Salome and worked steadily to poison the relationship, writing letters, carrying tales, and eventually engineering a rupture between Nietzsche and both of his friends at once. By the end of the year, he had lost Salome, lost Ray, and quarreled violently with his mother and sister, who took the family's side against him. He spent that winter in Rapallo in a condition close to collapse. His letters from those months are the darkest he ever wrote. He spoke of contemplating an end to it, of feeling that the whole apparatus of his life had come apart, of a loneliness that had passed beyond what he had words for. And out of that winter, in 10 days, he wrote the first part of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. He always insisted on the speed and on the strangeness of the process. He described it as a kind of dictation, a state of being seized, in which the whole thing came at once, with a force that left him shaking. He wrote the second part the following summer, again in about 10 days, and the third the winter after that, in the same way. It is the only one of his books written in a single sustained voice, and it is unlike anything else in philosophy, a mock scripture written in the cadences of Luther's German Bible, in which a prophet comes down from a mountain after 10 years of solitude to bring humanity a teaching, and is misunderstood, and withdraws, and returns. The book contains most of his central ideas in figurative form, and it is where the eternal recurrence is presented not as a thought experiment, but as a burden Zarathustra himself must learn to carry. There is a long passage in which he confronts the thought, and is made physically ill by it, and lies in bed for 7 days before he can rise and affirm it. Nietzsche knew perfectly well that the teaching he was proposing was not easy, and he made his prophet suffer over it exactly as he had. It is also where he set out the image of the 3 metamorphoses of the spirit, which is as clear a summary of his idea of human development as he ever gave. The spirit first becomes a camel, which kneels down to be loaded and carries the heaviest weights it can find, the whole inherited burden of duty and reverence and thou shalt, out into the desert. Then, in the desert, the camel becomes a lion, whose task is to fight the great dragon on whose every scale is written a commandment, and to win for itself the right to say no, to destroy the old values, to create the freedom in which something new might be made. But the lion cannot create. It can only clear the ground, and so the last metamorphosis is the strangest. The lion must become a child, because the child is innocence and forgetting, a new beginning, a game, a self-propelled wheel, a first movement, a sacred yes. The destruction is not the destination. It is the clearing of a space in which affirmation becomes possible. The whole trajectory of Nietzsche's thought runs from the camel's obedience through the lion's no to the child's yes, and Amor Fati is the disposition of the child at the end of it. Nobody read it. The first 2 parts sold a few dozen copies each. For the 4th part, he could find no publisher at all, and had it printed privately in an edition of 40 copies, of which he distributed, perhaps 7, because he could not think of enough people who would understand it. The obscurity of those years is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it is difficult, from a vantage point where Nietzsche is one of the most quoted writers in the world, to grasp how completely he was ignored while alive. He was not a neglected genius in the romantic sense, misunderstood by a public that was at least aware of him. He was, for practical purposes, unknown. He corresponded with a small handful of friends, most of whom did not really follow what he was doing. His old colleague Overbeck remained loyal, without pretending to grasp the philosophy, and the musician Peter Gast copied his manuscripts and served as a kind of one-man audience. His mother and sister regarded his books as a source of family embarrassment. Reviews, when they appeared, were few and largely uncomprehending. He minded this and said so, and then set about constructing an attitude toward it. He took to describing himself as a posthumous man, someone whose time had not yet come, and whose readers had not yet been born. And he wrote in one of his prefaces that some are born posthumously. It was partly a consolation, of course, and he knew it, but it was also a genuine philosophical position about how new values enter the world, which is never by being immediately understood, since a value that is immediately understood is by definition one that was already available. He believed that anything worth saying would necessarily sound wrong at first, and that the interval of being unheard was not an accident of bad luck, but a structural feature of doing the kind of work he was doing. This did not make the rented rooms less cold, but it allowed him to interpret the silence as evidence rather than as verdict, which is, among other things, a rather practical piece of Amor Fati applied to a career. The years after Zarathustra were the years of his hardest and clearest books, and they were written in almost complete obscurity, Beyond Good and Evil, which he also had to publish at his own expense, and On the Genealogy of Morality, in which he did the archaeological work of tracing the origins of moral concepts and produced his most sustained analysis of resentment. He wrote them in the same rhythm as before, in rented rooms, walking for hours, seeing almost no one. There were faint signs of recognition arriving from a distance. A Danish scholar named Georg Brandes began lecturing on his work in Copenhagen in 1888, the first academic anywhere to do so, and the news of it delighted him beyond measure. He was 44, and it was the first substantial recognition of his life. And then came 1888, which is one of the most extraordinary single years in the history of writing. In the space of roughly 12 months, mostly in Turin, a city he had fallen in love with and where he was for a time uncharacteristically happy, Nietzsche produced 5 books: The Case of Wagner, Twilight of the Idols, The Antichrist, Ecce Homo, and Nietzsche contra Wagner. The pace is barely credible for a healthy man, and he was not a healthy man. The prose is at its most brilliant and most concentrated, and it is also, in places, increasingly strange. The tone climbs steadily toward exaltation. The self-descriptions become grander. The chapter titles of Ecce Homo read, Why I am so wise, why I am so clever, why I write such good books, why I am a destiny. It is in Ecce Homo, written in the last weeks of that year, that he gave Amor Fati its final and most quoted formulation. In the chapter titled, Why I Am So Clever, my formula for greatness in a human being is Amor Fati, that one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity, not merely to bear what is necessary, still less to conceal it, but to love it. And it is worth remembering, when reading that sentence, exactly what the man writing it had to affirm. A father dead when he was 4, a body that had taken his profession and most of his working hours, a friendship that had ended in public warfare, a love that had been refused twice and then poisoned by his own sister, books that nobody bought, 10 years of rooms in foreign cities and meals eaten alone. He was not writing from a position of strength, and he knew it, and the formula is what it is because of that. It is also, read carefully, a formula about wanting rather than about feeling, and the distinction matters for anyone trying to make practical use of it. Nietzsche does not say that the person of great health feels warmly toward every event in their history, which would be either dishonest or impossible. He says that one wants nothing to be different. The test is not whether the memory of a thing is pleasant, but whether, given the actual choice, one would reach back and remove it, knowing that everything downstream of it would go too. Put that way, the doctrine becomes less mystical and rather more like an accounting question that most people have never actually sat down and answered. We say, casually and often, that we wish something had not happened. Amor Fati asks whether we mean it, whether we would really take the trade, and it suspects that in a great many cases, examined honestly, we would not. And when the answer genuinely is that we would, when the thing was simply loss with nothing built on it, Nietzsche has less to offer, and it is worth being honest about that limit, rather than pretending his philosophy covers every case. He was not writing a consolation for the bereaved and would have been impatient with the request. What he offers is narrower and harder, a way of standing toward a life that has already been lived, aimed at those who find themselves perpetually in dispute with their own history, and a claim that the dispute itself is the greater part of the damage. In the first days of January 1889, in the Piazza Carlo Alberto in Turin, Nietzsche collapsed. The account that has come down, which may have grown in the telling, but which has never been dislodged, is that he saw a cabman beating a horse, ran across the square, and threw his arms around the animal's neck to protect it, and fell to the ground. He was taken back to his lodgings, and in the days that followed, he sent a series of short, strange, exalted letters to friends across Europe, signing them variously as Dionysus and as the Crucified. His friend Franz Overbeck, alarmed by the letters, traveled from Basel, found him in a state he could not manage alone, and brought him back to Switzerland by train. He was never well again. He spent the remaining 11 years of his life under care, first in a clinic, then with his mother in Naumburg, and after her death with his sister in Weimar. And during that period he wrote nothing, and appears, for most of it, to have been beyond the reach of conversation. The cause has been debated for over a century, and the honest answer is that nobody knows with certainty. The long-standing assumption of a syphilitic infection has been seriously challenged, and a slow-growing tumor or an inherited neurological disease of the kind that killed his father are both taken seriously by modern scholars. What is not in doubt is that the collapse was organic and had been building for decades in the same body that had been producing headaches and vomiting and blindness since he was a student. There is a bitter irony in what happened next, and it has to be said plainly because it shaped his reputation for half a century. Fame arrived almost immediately after he ceased to be able to know it. Through the 1890s, his books were suddenly everywhere. His name became famous across Europe, and visitors came to Weimar to look at him, and his sister Elizabeth, who had returned from Paraguay after the failure of the anti-Semitic colony she and her husband had founded there, took control of him, of his manuscripts, and of his estate. She curated his literary remains with an entirely free hand, assembled unpublished notes into a book she presented as his masterwork, suppressed what did not suit her, and steered the interpretation of his philosophy toward the nationalism and racial politics he had spent his working life attacking with unmistakable contempt. She lived until 1935, long enough to accept the personal attentions of the new German regime. It took decades of scholarship after the war to disentangle what Nietzsche actually wrote from what his sister made of it, and the phrase about the whip and the women, endlessly quoted, comes from that same summer she helped destroy. Friedrich Nietzsche died in Weimar on the 25th of August in the year 1900 at the age of 55, having spent the last 11 years silent and the first 44 largely unread. And so we come, at the last, back to the great pyramidal rock beside Lake Silvaplana in the summer of 1881, and to the half-blind man who stopped there in the mountain light and received a thought like a lightning strike. We can see now what that moment was. It was not the arrival of a theory about the structure of the cosmos. It was the arrival of a question addressed to a life, and it came to the person least equipped to answer it comfortably and most qualified to answer it honestly. Everything that looked, from outside, like the wreckage of a career, the resignation, the illness, the lost friendships, the unsold books, the rented rooms, was in truth the material he was being asked about. The demon's question was not academic for him. It was, would you take this, again, exactly, forever? And he spent the remaining 8 years of his working life constructing an answer, and the answer was yes. This is what he left us, and it asks nothing of us tonight but to be received. He left us the recognition that a life is not a set of separable episodes, but a single indivisible thing, so that the parts we would remove are load-bearing, and the person who wishes them away is wishing away the self that was built on them. He left us the demon's question, which strips away the comfortable idea that this is a rough draft and the real version is coming later. He left us the warning about resentment, the observation that the endless internal case against what has happened is the most expensive habit a person can keep, and the strange practical counsel that looking away is a better negation than accusation. He left us the 3 metamorphoses, the camel and the lion and the child, and the reminder that the no is only ever a clearing of ground, and that the destination is the sacred yes. And he left us the formula itself, which is not a comfort and was never meant to be one, not merely to bear what is necessary, still less to conceal it, but to love it. There is no hurry now, and nothing to settle, and nothing left to argue. Whatever this day contained, it is now among the things that are necessary, part of the single indivisible thing, no longer available for revision. The accounting can be set down. The case against the day can be left unheard. And if there is a thought to carry into sleep, let it be the one that came to a sick and solitary man on a mountain path in the summer of 1881, which is that this hour, exactly as it was, is not a step on the way to some better hour that will justify it, but is itself the thing, complete, and worthy of being wanted again. Let the light go. Let the mountain be dark. and let the last movement of the mind be the smallest possible version of the yes he spent his life learning to say.